compare a Ronald Reagan with a Donald Trump. So what are some of their similarities and what are some of their perhaps more glaring differences?
I've thought about that, and I've thought about the question of communication, because Reagan, as we've talked about, had that mellifluous way of speaking, of making people feel good about themselves. Even when he was criticizing abstractly government or welfare cheats or whatever, he was celebrating American virtues and talking to people at a level that comforted them and made them feel like, yeah, America's good at heart. Despite Watergate, despite Vietnam, we have goodness that will be restored. Trump, he's not as articulate. He has a very kind of limited vocabulary, but he has a way of speaking that's very direct and effective with his followers. They like his forthrightness, that he speaks his mind.
He's unfiltered.
And we've been feeling like politicians are mealy-mouthed and constantly equivocating and using talking points. And Trump doesn't do that. He just speaks. And he speaks the way I presume he speaks often to people around him. And so at some level, it's sort of refreshing for people who think the way he does, that finally there's a politician who's unguarded and doesn't care what people are going to say and can fight with that kind of language. But his modes of communication also are the internet and social media. So he's the first president to sort of engage with the people directly by using all caps, shouting his disdain for people around him, for his critics and so on. And so he's not attempting to bridge the gap between him and other people in a way that I think Reagan, even though he was pushing and polarizing in a lot of ways, still had room to work across the floor with Democrats. He was leveraging his popularity to put pressure on Democrats to realize that he was more popular than they were on a lot of issues. But he just had a friendlier disposition. Trump comes across as angry and distasteful and very egotistical.
It's interesting because they both come out of show business in many ways. They're both performers. Ronald Reagan apparently once told Warren Beatty, among others, that, quote, he couldn't understand how anyone could be president without first being an actor. Yeah. He was a real performer. He was a performer, but somehow it didn't seem performative.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it was performative in that the gap between the things he said and reality is really hard to get over. You can't get past the fact that he said things about America that were demonstrably untrue or things that happened that were untrue. So it was irksome to hear them and say, do you really believe that people are on the street because they actually have good homes and jobs, but they're too lazy to have them? Is that the way you really see the world? Or are you saying that because you want to find a justification to cut social services?
He talked about welfare queens.
All the time. And it was central to his change because, as you said, he had been a supporter of the New Deal. He had been at least seemed to be more or less a supporter of the Great Society or parts of it, maybe not the racial side of it. And then somehow in the late 60s, early 70s, all that goes out the window, and the working poor that he worshipped in the 1930s and 40s were suddenly welfare sponges.
Both Trump and Reagan seem to be much more aligned with the corporate class than with the laboring classes. In 1981, Ronald Reagan tries to break the back of labor by going after air traffic controllers. And this is just a couple years before Margaret Thatcher, his great friend and comrade, she breaks the backs of the miners in 83, 84. Is there some similarity between how Trump engages with working peoples and the way Reagan did?
So Reagan's approach to the air traffic controllers, that was a federal union, right? That was a government union. So he took the view that he had the power to fire them in a way that he wouldn't have interfered necessarily in other labor disputes with the same draconian sense. But
he fired 11,000, I think, 11,000 people lose their jobs.
Yeah, he gave them the opportunity to go back now or you lose your job, and they lost the ones who didn't go back lost their jobs. Certainly, it was known that he was hostile to labor And that was the perception that labor was holding American capital back by maintaining high labor costs, which was central to his economic policies. I mean, my sense is that Trump uses the culture wars to speak to working Americans more than economic theory. You can certainly make the case that if you raise tariffs, the jobs will come back to America in some sectors. In places and parts of America where the jobs have been lost 20, 30 years ago anyway. So they're not restoring jobs that have been recently lost, but somehow bringing good manufacturing jobs back. But those good manufacturing jobs were good because they were unionized and they paid well and they could support the towns around them. So it's not clear that he's necessarily committed to that. But I think his popularity in his parts of America rests to a considerable degree on the way he talks, the way he perceives himself as self-made and wealthy. And you all want to live like me. I'm surrounding myself in the White House. I'm gilding it in gold to show how successful I have been.